Today's lecture is on the Texas Constitution, and this is Chapter 3 from your book. Now, when it comes to the states, in order to exist as a state, there must be a constitution. There has to be a constitutional convention. They have to say this is what this particular state is going to look like. And what they are doing is that they are establishing the government and the governance structure for the state. And so each of the states has to have certain different parts of it, and we call these parts articles. And so it's going to be telling the state what their separation of powers is going to look like. And the separation of powers is basically the executive office, their legislative branch, their judiciary branch. And if there's going to be a Bill of Rights that are going to be specific to that particular state. So we are going to be focusing on the state of Texas and what the Constitution for the state of Texas provides for us and for the people that live within the state. Okay, Texas is one of the longest and most restrictive constitutions. The way that we have to pass bills, we have to do this through amendments, and I'll be talking about this later on. And so there are currently about 467 amendments that we have to vote in. And this is even a little bit dated because every time that there is an election, every time that there's the legislature meets, we have to go ahead and approve certain amendments through an election. So the Constitution itself is about 90,000 words, and that's a lot. And so if you ever want to read the Texas Constitution, you can do that through this particular website called Texas Legislature Online, and it's got a search engine. If there's something that you want to know about Texas, just go ahead and put the words in there and see what comes up. But basically, the Constitution that we have now reflects the interests and the concerns of the writers of the Constitution, and the writers of the Constitution were from 1876. We talked about this, when in the first lecture on the politics and the history of Texas. So there have been many constitutions and constitutional conventions, but I'm really going to focus only on a few of them and why I think that they are important. Okay, the first one I want to talk about is the Constitution of 1869. And so the Constitutional Convention was held in 1868. And so what they were going to do with this particular Constitution, they were saying, we want to have a lot of power coming from Austin, our state capital, and they were going to centralize that power in the executive office, in the office of the governor. And so what they did is that they went ahead and set it up so that the governor was going to have the ability to pretty much run the show in the state of Texas. So they lengthened his gubernatorial term to 4 years, and they allowed the governor to appoint all of the major state offices and all of the judges that were going to be serving in different capacities within the state of Texas. So that's already saying right there that it's giving the governor a lot of power. The other thing that it did is that it provided that we would have annual legislative sessions, which basically is saying the Texas legislature is going to meet every year. And so they wanted to keep local government kind of weak because they wanted most of the decisions to come from Austin. They wanted it to be centralized within the office of the governor. At that time, they also centralized the public school system. So, right now it's very decentralized, but at that time, all of the decisions on how the school districts are going to be set up the decisions were going to be made in Austin. So a lot of centralization. So basically what this is saying is that at that time it reflected very little fear of having so much power within one office, of having such centralized government power coming from Austin. But because of what happened with E.J. Davis, and I'll be talking, and I've mentioned him before, we're going to start talking about him again, but that fear was to later become the hallmark of Texas government, why we as Texans say we don't want a lot of government. And it doesn't matter what your political party is. It doesn't matter if you're liberal, it doesn't matter if you're conservative. we in Texas don't like to have a lot of government intervention, and it was because of the way that this particular constitution was set up. Anyway, so this constitution was ratified in 1869. Okay, this is E.J. Davis that I keep talking about. So remember this guy because he really changed the way of how we viewed politics in the state of Texas. So this era was regarded as the most corrupt and the most abusive in the state's history because of this E.J. Davis guy. And so under his governorship, there was a misappropriation of funds, which basically was saying, he was probably keeping the money, wasteful public programs, and that means that he had public programs set up that really didn't need to be set up, but he did it, and a lot of times it's so that he would look good. Let's see what he do. He had the property taxes. So let me talk a little bit about property taxes. If you own a home, and even if you rent, you have to pay property taxes. But if you rent, the property taxes are part of your rent. But if you own a home, it depends on the value of your house, the value that it's appraised for, and how much you're going to be paying depending on, your city, your school district. We'll talk more about property taxes whenever we talk about local government. But anyway, so the property taxes were really pretty high. And so they were so high that the landowners were saying, no, it's too much. You're asking us to pay too much. So they just refused to pay it. Well, the problem was that there was no money going into the to be used as resources. So all of a sudden they had to borrow money in order to pay off this public debt. So the result of all of these actions, that he was wasting money, landowners refused to pay their property taxes, there was no money coming in, so they had to borrow money in order to be able to pay the bills. So because E.J. Davis was so corrupt, and government kind of collapsed, law and order kind of collapsed. So what happened is that because there was no civil order, that a lot of these desperados, banditos, whatever you want to call them, Native Americans, they came in, they started stirring things up, and it became like the wild, wild west here in Texas. And so anytime that there's any kind of civil unrest like that, then somebody needs to step in and say, okay, we need to go ahead and establish some order here. And the one that usually does that is the military. And so and that was the same thing that happened in this case. The state militia came in, the state police came in order to be able to maintain law and order. But what happened is that they became a very powerful political machine. And that term political machine just means that they are the ones that were running the show. They are the ones that were able to get things done, but they did it by using strong armed tactics. And so this particular time period was very tyrannical because they were running it almost like a dictatorship. So a lot of tyranny. So again, this was not a good deal. And so the state militia came in and they said, well, we want to go ahead and we want to take over, and we can only do that by getting rid of this E.J. Davis guy. So he was ousted by Koch and his supporters, and they actually marched down Guadalupe Street in Austin singing the Yellow Rose of Texas and physically threw him out of office. And so basically kind of left really bitter memories for the state because it was such a humiliating time for Texas because it was so corrupt, so extravagant, so tyrannical. It was just not a good day for Texas at all. So then they said, okay, well, we need to go ahead and get a new constitution. And this particular era was known as the era of retrenchment and reform. And so the Democrats were the ones that were going to be setting it up. And they said, you know what? We want to strike at the heart of big government, which basically means we do not want to have a large government. We do not want government to have a lot of power. So they said, okay, well, we're going to have to go ahead and have another constitutional convention. So they convened in 1873, and they said, we're going to write a constitution that's going to make government weak. So let's make government weak. So let's talk about what they did. The first thing that they did is that they said this frugal tone, and frugal just means, they're going to pinch pennies. So they cut the salaries of all of the governing officials. They were saying we're not going to let these politicians get rich on us. They place strict limits on property taxes. And when it comes to property taxes, how much can you charge per $100,000 of property appraisal? And so they limited the amount because of that landowner situation under E.J. Davis. They restricted what you could borrow money from. In the state of Texas, we will never run in the red. During the Great Recession, which was just like several years ago, 2007, 2008, and it lasted like 4 years or so, a lot of the states did not do well. They had to cut their programs. They had to get rid of people, lay off their state employees. They had to lay off faculty from the state institutions. But Texas didn't really do that badly because the way that it works in Texas is to restrict state borrowing. The way that it works, it says if there's going to be, say, a new position open, say here at the university, because we are a state institution, they have to make sure that the money is there first. They can't just go spend the money. They will go ahead and encumber those funds. And so the money has to be there before they allow an expense to take place. And borrowing is only allowed under very, very strict conditions because Texas didn't want to have to go into debt again ever. This constitution restricted the power granted to the government officials, and they basically said, we're not going to let our government officials, our politicians, our elected politicians really make laws that are going to be affect our Texans in many ways. We're going to restrict the things that they can do. When it comes to the governor's position, because of E.J. Davis and that centralized government governor's position, they said we're not going to do that anymore. So most of the powers were stripped from the governor's office. They reduced the term to 2 years, and it was 4 years before, and it's changed since that time. But at that time, they reduced the term to 2 years and they cut the salary. They said we don't want this guy making a lot of money, and we don't want him to be serving for long periods of time if he's not doing a good job. We need to be able to vote him out. Now, different from the other constitution, instead of the state judges being appointed, now all of our attorney generals and our state judges were going to be elected. So that was like a major shift. So no more appointments that the governor could put in his cronies in there. They said no, the people are going to be electing in the attorney general, which is like the lead lawyer for the state, and the state judges that sit on the different benches and the appeals court, that type of thing. They're going to be elected. We are going to elect them. They shortened the legislative session to 2 years because it was under the old Constitution, the 1869 Constitution, it was every year, and they said no, we're going to have it every 2 years now, and there's going to be a limited time that they're going to be spending in sessions, and that limited time period is basically 140 days that they cannot meet for very long. So when it comes to actually like passing the laws, it actually restricted the types of laws or legislate or policies that the legislature can enact or can pass. And so because of the way that it's set up, some laws can be passed, but if it's going to affect a lot of people, we have to vote it in. We, the public, have to vote it in. And we do that through the constitutional amendments. And so they are statute-like. They become laws. They become laws. So we vote them in, and then it goes into the Constitution. Okay, remember I told you in the last lecture that there was a constitutional amendment that was passed that said in the state of Texas, marriage is between a man and a woman. Okay, well, that's what it's talking about. We had to make this, we had to pass this particular amendment, and it became a law. It became a statute. The other thing that it did is that it strengthened what local government does. Because under the old Constitution, local government was very weak. And so they strengthened local government, and especially the counties. Especially the counties. Because Texas is so big, this Constitution says we're going to allow the counties to have a lot of the administrative and judicial functions for the state because Texas is so huge. Like, let me give you an example of this one. When you register your car, you receive your notice saying your car needs to be registered or whatever, but the tag on it itself says the state of Texas. It doesn't say Nueces County, but you do it through Nueces County. Like, you can go down to the courthouse, you can go down to HEB or whatever, but it's done through the county. So that's like an example of an administrative function that the county does for the state of Texas. So the tone of the convention was a reaction to say we're not going to have a lot of power in the state. We're not going to allow the abuse of state power anymore. So they just denied it. They said we're not going to allow these politicians to abuse state power that we entrust to them whenever we do elect them in. So the voters ratified this state constitution in 1876, and this is the one that remains in use today with some changes. So we're going to be talking about the changes of how the Constitution looks like today.